What's up, everybody? Corey Hughes, Bloody History. We're going to pick up right from where we left off yesterday. David Atlee Phillips being questioned by Mr. Goldsmith, CIA stooge, who works for the HSCA, right? We covered that when we went over the last couple interviews that he did. I think particularly with Alan B. White and Goodpasture. We're making our way through these Mexico City station transcripts. The fascinating part is the level of coordination of lying. All these fucking people are guilty of cover-up. All because David Atlee Phillips, as Jim most astutely pointed out, that David Atlee Phillips was probably Kerry Thornley's handler in Mexico City, coordinating his activities in Mexico City. So the one thing that I'm trying to jive, the one thing I'm trying to make jive is, obviously, we have Kerry Thornley in Mexico City at the end of August and the beginning of September, as per his own admission, right? He admits that he went through Mexico City on his way back to New Orleans during his 4-month alibi, right? In Whittier, California. Motherfucker had a 4-month alibi. Holy shit. How does that work? That's ultimately what his trip to Whittier, California was, a 4-month alibi, right? That was 4 months that he could be doing whatever the CIA wanted him to be doing anywhere in the country, while he was allegedly working at a fucking restaurant in Whittier, California, and then a second restaurant somewhere south of Whittier. I forget what town that second city he was allegedly in was. I should know that. But yeah, he makes his way back to New Orleans, going through Mexico City at the end of August, and makes his way back to New Orleans on September 4th, right? Which is perfect timing because it's in those 3 weeks between then and September 25th, when he allegedly had to be leaving on a bus to go to Mexico City, that he's seen by Perry Russo and identified as Leon Oswald, and he had a big old beard, right? So he was the bearded beatnik, but we never get a description of the beard other than he was a bearded beatnik, and we have a photograph of Kerry Thornley. The thing I'm trying to make jive is if he was in Mexico City at the end of August and mistaken for Oswald. He couldn't have had a beard in Mexico City, but he probably had his typical stubble because he was lazy, right? He shaved like twice a week, maybe 3 times a week. That was it, when Oswald shaved every day. So, he had to, the day he left Mexico City, he had to have stopped shaving, and then didn't shave until a couple days before the party, which would have been September like 23rd, 24th, something like that. So that's the only thing I've been trying to make jive, is he was not bearded in Mexico City, but he had to have been bearded within 2 weeks of that. So, God, it's the little nitpicky things that most people wouldn't give a fuck about, but I'm sitting here talking about Kerry Thornley's fucking beard. Give me a fucking break. Where did I go wrong in life? All right, so let's just pick up from where we are. This is Mr. Goldsmith, CIA stooge attorney for the HSCA, who was also had to have been coordinating with George Joannides, right? Who was the CIA guy who was working JM Wave, head of psychological operations for them, but he was in New Orleans during summer '63, where he was working with the Cubans, allegedly. But I don't buy that he was working with the fucking Cubans, because nobody gave a fuck about the Cubans, okay? The Cubans are all misdirection. All misdirection, right? Because they were still working with Castro. They had to have been. So that means nothing that we're told about the official story of them trying to kill Castro makes any sense at all. None. Zero. Right? If the CIA was still using Cuba as a jump-off point for smuggling operations, then Castro was involved. End of fucking story. And we know that there were certain people who were allowed to stay on in Cuba after the mob allegedly got kicked out. So, yeah, I have no doubts that there were still smuggling operations going on with Cuba. Therefore, all that attention wouldn't have had to have been dedicated to Cuba and overthrowing Castro. So that all that had to have been misdirection. We know all the weapons that were supposed to go to the Cubans ended up in fucking Israel, right? So, but David Atlee Phillips, allegedly head of Cuban operations, but stationed in Mexico City. He was the head of covert operations for that station. So he would have been handling all the people who would have been using fake names and doing various operations in the area, right? So there's no possibility at all that Kerry Thornley could have come to Mexico City, jumped back and forth between these embassies numerous times while working for the CIA, and David Atlee Phillips didn't know about it. He had to have been brought in on it. He had to have been, because he's the one who had to have been overseeing the destruction of any photography, right? Either that, or they knew when he was coming and when they could turn the cameras off so he could go at those times. But they have their audio recordings, right? We'll never hear those audio recordings because we'll instantly know it wasn't Oswald, right? And the Oswald in Mexico City story still depends upon the recordings, right? Without those fucking recordings and without the transcripts of those recordings, there's no alleged proof that Oswald was ever down there. And like, who could ever believe for a split second that somebody was impersonating Oswald there, right? Even though they have the photograph of Saul Sage sent back by Ann Goodpasture, but we already covered the very non-conspiratorial reason for that being sent back, right? That he was the only American-looking person who went there that day. But we know that's not the case. And here's the deal. This is something that, like, a lot of people have a hard time with. We're given a lot of information, right? But you have to look at where that source of that information comes from. And we can't believe the sources of most of the information that we get in reference to the Kennedy assassination from official sources. You have to read between the lines, so to speak, right? Like when they say that Oswald said this in custody. Oh yeah, who said that? A liar? Like Curry or Decker or Roger Craig? Right? There's not a single motherfucking word that Oswald could have ever said while in custody that we can possibly ever believe, because every single fucking thing that we think we know that Oswald said came from one of a handful of liars who was in on this. So fucking why do people still continue to use Oswald's words in custody as part of evidence of anything? It's the same thing here. We are told that the appearance of allegedly Oswald, who was really Kerry Thornley, was on a certain date at a certain time, and that he was here at a certain date at a certain time. But who's telling us these things? The FBI, the CIA, Customs, Border Patrol, the Mexican FBI, organizations we can't trust. We can't trust any of them because they can just fabricate the dates and times and be like, see, it fits our time frame. Like, we fucking know Oswald was in New Orleans on the 26th of September and not on a bus to fucking Mexico City because he filled out the paperwork to close his P.O. box and leave a forwarding address, right? 2 documents that were signed by him on September 26th in New Orleans. That precludes him from having gone there, right? Yet people still like to persist this myth that he went to Mexico City. So we can't believe a lot of the things that these people tell us. They have to either A, fit into a greater storyline, right, that we can understand, that makes sense, or there has to be some corroboration, right? It has to be theoretically plausible or corroboratable. Really, you want both to come to any kind of real conclusion on anything. But, all right, let me continue with this. Sorry about the rambling. All right, sir. David Atlee Phillips says, I have not read it thoroughly, but I do recall this message. Mr. Goldsmith says, is this the cable that CIA headquarters sent to Mexico City Station responding to the cable of 10-9 from Mexico City Station? It is my understanding that is this, correct? Mr. Goldsmith says, now reading the first paragraph of this cable, which is dated October 11th, 63, it refers to Oswald as Lee Henry Oswald. Yes, sir. Your testimony in November of 1976, as you have indicated before, is that the cable that came back from headquarters corrected Oswald's name as that name was sent up from Mexico City Station to headquarters, yet this cable from CIA headquarters refers to Oswald as Lee Henry Oswald, in fact, not using his proper name. In light of that, is there any way that you can explain the inconsistency between your testimony and the cable? Yes, I feel quite sure about it now. I have the recollection Lee Henry Oswald and I somehow came up with the idea that in Mexico City we had decided Henry Oswald. Later I saw a copy of this or something very close to it. I believe I might have been shown a copy during my testimony, but even before that, in any event, I saw this cable. I'm now absolutely convinced that I made that error remembering this cable which described Lee Harvey Oswald. I wrote a book, and a portion of that had to do with Mexico City and Oswald, and in that book I said Lee Henry Oswald, and I believe that is where the Henry came from, and I was incorrect in saying it came from Mexico, and during redacted a disservice about it, because I indicated that she or whoever was listening to this, and it must have been this Boris fellow, but that is the way it was. Now I'm sure it was this message that gave me the Lee Henry Oswald. All right, I'd just like to, let me just comment really quickly. A bunch of times I have looked at people handwriting Lee Harvey Oswald, but in cursive. And the Harvey kind of looks like Henry. And so I'm more inclined to believe that David Atlee Phillips saw it written out by hand in script and just misinterpreted Henry for Harvey. Because I've done that a couple times myself. And so, now, the problem is when you're a high-level CIA agent, there's a thing that's called attention to detail, and that is extremely important, right? And so you would think that he would take the time to not make a mistake, because it's very important at this high level that you don't make a fucking mistake, right? So, that kind of leads me to not to know what to believe about this. The Henry seems to have been an obfuscation. Lee Henry also could have been some way for them internally to differentiate between the real Oswald and the other Oswald, which in this case is Kerry Thornley, right? So that's always a possibility as well. Mr. Goldsmith says, referring your attention to document number 183, there's an arrow pointing to the Henry and the word sick underscored right next to the arrow. That is Win Scott's handwriting, is it not? It is such a small word that I would hate to say for sure, but it looks like that to me, yes. So apparently Mr. Scott recognized the middle name Henry being incorrect and wrote down sick next to it. What does the term sick mean to you as you know it? Is that term customarily used? Certainly it meant this way the message arrived. This is the way it was written, but from what I gather, there is, well, the normal usage by putting that down is a way to say that it certainly does indicate that he feels that it is not correct. Right. Mr. Scott was a man with a near photographic memory. He was a stickler for detail. Do you have any reason to believe that when this cable was received in October of 1963, Mr. Scott knew that cable's reference to Lee Henry Oswald was incorrect? No, I don't recall that, but reading this, obviously at whatever time he wrote that sick on there, he felt it was incorrect or he would not have spotlighted it that way. But I don't have any recollection. I don't have any recollection that we knew before this cable came back down that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. So here he's saying that they didn't have any reason to think it was incorrect at that time because they didn't know anything at that time. They wouldn't have any information at that time. But we have Win Scott writing sick under it because he knew it was wrong because he obviously had heard the name Lee Harvey Oswald prior to that, right? So it gives you a little insight that Win Scott knew something at a time he probably shouldn't have known something. What was your relationship like with Mr. Scott? Quite close. I think he trusted me, trusted my judgment, and so it was a relatively close professional relationship. Mr. Scott is a man who, if he likes someone and it is obvious that he likes them, and I felt that he liked me, he is an unusual man. I admired him in many ways, and in some ways I didn't, but it was a close relationship. Is it true that he was a very competent and demanding station chief? Absolutely. Before we leave this cable, I would like to refer you to your testimony before the committee, specifically page 84 of that testimony, line 4. Yes, sir. Having read that, is it true that in your testimony before the committee in November of 76, you indicated that you recall the cable from headquarters straightened out the record about Oswald's name? Yes, that's what I said. Having since had a chance to review those documents, I believe that my recollection was false. When did you review the documents? Well, just now during my last testimony, I recall being shown the first brief cable in sanitized form. Yes, in sanitized form. Would you please now refer to CIA number 13, which is in that folder? All right, sir. Can you identify this document? This is an example of the transcripts which were made from the tapes from this telephone coverage. What is the date of this particular document in the upper right-hand corner? 1st of October 63. So is it fair to say that this is a conversation that was tape recorded on October 1st, 63? Yes, undoubtedly. And that conversation came into the Soviet embassy sometime after 9:55 in the morning. Yes, I would say close to 9:55. Would you now read the transcript itself? Yes. Is this the transcript that you read which prompted the Manels to send a cable to headquarters? I'm not positive, but I think so. I must say, for the record, there is a line in there that surprises me. I did not recall that he said I was at your place, indicating that he had been at the Soviet Union. I did not think that Lee Harvey Oswald had actually visited in person the Soviet embassy. Fine, but in substance, that is the intercept that you recall, or rather, that is the transcript that you recall seeing in early October 63 in reference to Oswald's contact with the Soviets. I cannot be positive. I see here it says the same person who phoned a day or so ago and spoke in broken Russian, so apparently there are two messages referred to, so I'm not positive that this is the one or the other one or both. Up at the top where it says the same person who phoned a day ago or so and spoke in broken Russian speaks to Obyedkov. Obyedkov must be the other guy on the end of the line who Oswald allegedly spoke to. This cable does identify Lee Harvey Oswald, does it not? Or rather, he identifies himself? This is a transcript. I'm sorry? You're right, a transcript. Yes, it definitely does identify Lee Oswald. Is there any reference in this transcript to a visa? No, there is not. He says that he spoke to the consular. One might gather that he was speaking about visa matters, but he does not say that. Is there any indication in here that Oswald is saying, why don't you do this, or intimating that the Soviets should talk to him? No, there is not. Let's take a look again at the cable that was sent by the redacted to headquarters. It is number 177, CIA number 177. All right. Is it accurate to say that this transcript, the one that appears in the CIA number 13, can be tied into the cable that was sent on October 1st that appears in CIA number 177? Yes, I would say that that transcript is the basis for the first paragraph of this. Let's look into now into CIA number 14. You might want to read both 14 and 15. Here, number 15 as a translation. However, I take it you are familiar with the Spanish? I do speak Spanish, yes. All right, sir. Mr. Goldsmith then says, can you identify this transcript? Yes, this is obviously a transcript of a conversation in which Spanish was spoken from the Cuban embassy, and consequently I would presume it was an intercept from phones in the Cuban embassy, but of course it could have been on Soviet phones picking up a call if it was coming in from the Cuban embassy. What is the date on which this conversation took place? 28th September 63, at approximately 11:51 hours. I don't see that, Consular. Oh yes, I see that now. Yes, 11:51. Is this the transcript that you read which triggered the cable to Washington, D.C. CIA headquarters? No, I don't think it was. It seems to me this is the one which became important after the assassination. Fine, are you testifying that this transcript was not reviewed by anyone at the Mexico City station until after the assassination? Oh no, absolutely not. Please clarify the record. Oh, all right. As a matter of fact, I can see by the notes here that it was reviewed by people and so forth. There is one thing that I would like to insert at this moment for the record, something that I can't recall exactly, which might have a bearing. I was in Mexico City doing one job when I first arrived in 61. Later, I was told that I was going to leave that job and assume Cuban responsibilities in the station. I don't recall the precise time I formally changed from my old job to the Cuban one. I did know there was a long period when I was wearing both hats, not officially to Cuba. So some of the Cuban documents, even though I was very much interested at that time, I would not have reviewed, and it would appear from this, for instance, that I didn't necessarily review this one because I see other people's names on it. All right. For purposes of clarification, is your testimony then that your testimony is not that this was not reviewed until after the assassination, but simply that it was not linked to Oswald until after the assassination? That's right, yes. These refer to CIA number 17. Can you read that again? I believe this is a translation on the next page. All right. Yes, sir. Mr. Goldsmith says, can you identify this transcript? Mr. Phillips then says, yes, this transcript would be one of the Soviet embassy regarding an incoming call from the Cuban consulate on the 27th of September. At approximately 16:05 hours, is that correct? Yes, and I noticed in the English translation, at least, it does not mention something about a visa. Or I'm sorry, at least it does mention something about a visa. Is this the transcript that you read which resulted in a cable being sent to Washington, D.C.? I don't believe so, because I don't believe this says this Lee Harvey Oswald, whereas the other one did so. This might have been part of the reason why it was sent by the Soviet people and so forth, but I don't recall that this particularly was it, no. And there is also this indication here that in there of Oswald saying, why don't we do this, or intimating that the Soviets should talk to him. No. Would you please refer now to CIA number 19 and read that one? Yes, I have gone through it rapidly. I do recall this. Would you identify this particular transcript? This is a transcript of coverage of the Cuban embassy, and apparently what has happened here is that there was coverage at both ends, and it looks to me like it is a double tapping of a telephone possibly, but this apparently originated in the Cuban embassy and was tapped there. It is in Spanish, so it was the Spanish working on the translator. No, this tap would have been off the phone from the Soviet embassy, would it not? Yes, I can see now that it was. The reason for that is that it indicates on page 20, meaning individual voice. IV meaning individual voice. Yes, I see that now. Is this the transcript that you read which resulted in the cable being sent to Washington in reference to Oswald? I don't recall. There is no mention here of Oswald saying, why don't you do this, or intimating that they should talk to him. No. How soon after the first intercept did you receive a transcript of Oswald's voice, or rather Oswald's conversation? I'm not sure that I received after the conversation a copy of the transcript. What I am sure is that the cable that went out as a result, so I am not sure that I saw these things until after the assassination, at which time, of course, going back, but I don't recall that I actually saw them. I may have, but I don't recall them. Let's refer to page 75 of your transcript, testimony. I'm sorry, of your testimony. Mr. Phillips says, I'm sorry. Specifically line 18. Yes. Would you read from line 18 to line 23? Mr. Sprague, do you know approximately... Oh, no, read it to yourself, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Goldsmith says, does this refresh your recollection as to, well, first of all, whether or not you actually saw the intercept after it came in? By intercept, I'm referring to transcript. Reading from this, it makes it clear that I thought that I had seen the transcript and the cable which resulted from it, but I cannot be positive, despite the statement that I actually saw the transcript itself until after the assassination. Did you indicate to the committee at that time that you were not sure whether or not you had seen the transcript? I don't recall, but according to your testimony here, you did receive the transcript 3 days after the intercept came in. Obviously, that is the inference to be drawn from the transcript, yes. Mr. Chairman, I have been told by the clerk that we're going to be having a vote in a few minutes, so if you want to recess for lunch, this might be the appropriate time. And then Mr. Pryor says, I suggest we recess until 2 o'clock, and then that's it. And then fast forward. All right, here we go. Fast forward to 4:07 p.m. Mr. Pryor says the committee will resume. Mr. Phillips, if you will be seated, I will recognize Mr. Goldsmith. Thank you. Testimony of Mr. David Phillips resumed. Mr. Goldsmith, Mr. Phillips, during the afternoon recess, have you had the opportunity to read the transcript that was prepared of your testimony before the committee in November of 1976? Yes, I have. And during the afternoon recess, did you at any time discuss your testimony before the committee this morning with anyone? I did not. Or contact anyone in any way? I did not. For background purposes, I would like to indicate that the allegations or the issues before this committee are indeed very serious ones. The committee is trying to determine who killed the president, whether there was a conspiracy. Specifically in the area of Mexico City, the committee is trying to determine what Oswald was doing there, if he was there at all. The committee is also looking into allegations that Oswald was in some way connected with the U.S. intelligence agency, whether or not Oswald was an agent, whether the agency was in some way involved in the assassination. It is an allegation that has been made, although the committee is not predisposed in any way towards resolving that issue. The specific question of the cable traffic, the transcripts, the tapes, and photos bear direct upon these issues. Can you see that? I understand that. I would like to raise a couple of questions with you pertaining to your testimony this morning. First, do you recall whether or not you actually signed off on the cable of October 8th from Mexico City Station to CIA headquarters? I believe now that I did not, since I saw a copy of the cable, which I believe is the one you are referring to, and I did not see my signature on it. But would you concede that a fair reading of the record of your testimony in November would suggest that you in fact did sign off on the cable? That I either signed off on it or certainly was aware of it, yes. Based upon the transcripts that we reviewed this morning, I think if we were to review each one, it would be possible to establish that Oswald visited the Cuban embassy and Russian embassy or consulates a total of 5 times. We could go through each one if you would like, but are you willing to accept my word for that? Certainly. In light of the fact that Oswald visited these embassies and consulates a total of 5 times, is there any explanation for how the agency failed to obtain a photograph of him? First, concerning his visits to the Soviet embassy. Until I saw those messages this morning in which Oswald was saying, I have paid a visit to your place, I had thought until this morning that Oswald that we didn't have any record of the fact that he actually visited the Soviet embassy in person, which of course would explain why there was no photograph of him. The explanation, as far as the Cuban embassy was concerned, was that there was photographic coverage of the consulate, and as I recall it, he visited on a Friday when that camera was not working. The explanation for the following day, the Saturday, would be that at the time we didn't photograph people who went in on weekends. Again, people, I have to remind you, do you really think the CIA just took the weekends off? Give me a fucking break. Afterwards, I think Saturday coverage was instituted because of the Oswald thing. Mr. Goldsmith says, okay, I'm not sure that your answer was completely responsive to my question. The first part of your answer was that until you reviewed the cable traffic or transcripts, you were not aware of the visit to the Soviet embassy. That's correct. But that doesn't explain why, if there was surveillance of the Soviet embassy, Oswald's picture was not obtained. Do you follow what I'm saying? Yes. What I'm trying to say is that the only thing in my mind, the only explanation was that he did indeed not visit the Soviet embassy in person. I thought that he did not. But assuming that he did, as I believe the transcripts demonstrate, there should have been a picture. And your knowledge, was there such a picture? No, I never saw a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I've always believed that no picture of him existed. After the assassination was when Scott upset about the failure of the photo surveillance units to obtain photographs of Oswald. I'm sure I can say that he was disappointed. I don't think that I would recall that he was upset in the same sense that he was berating anyone or anything. Did he discuss it with you at all? Not that I recall, and I think it would be unlikely that he would, since I was not involved in the mechanical business of that photography. And I believe in your testimony of November of 76, you indicated that the photograph that was obtained, that was mistakenly linked to Oswald, was linked to him because Redacted had a transcript before her. The transcript indicated someone was going to the Soviet embassy to obtain a visa, and she had a picture of a man who left the embassy about that time, okay? Okay, so the Redacted is Ann Goodpaster. Mr. Phillips says, yes, that was my understanding of why this message went out in sort of 2 parts. Do you know if the agency made any effort to identify other non-Latins whom it saw either entering or leaving the Soviet or Cuban consulates or embassies? You mean generally, or in the specific case of this unidentified, in the specific case of the Oswald issue? I don't know what might have been done at headquarters, and I don't recall specifically of an effort made in Mexico, but answering your question in a general sense, yes, you always tried to find out who it was and what steps were actually taken. I don't know. For purposes of clarification by my question, I meant when they made reference to that picture in the cable that was sent to headquarters on October 8th, prior to coming up with the conclusion that this picture was Oswald, did they attempt to identify every other non-Latin who visited those embassies? Yes, that was pretty standard procedure. I would like to get back and deal with another matter that was raised this morning. How soon after the first intercept did you receive the transcript of Oswald's conversation? I don't recall precisely. Generally, it was a matter of, they came pretty rapidly. It seemed to me the next day, or say within 2 days, something like that was the normal time. But you will recall my previous testimony that the transcript concerning his visit to the Cuban embassy was really important to us after the assassination, so I can't recall the date that I first saw it. Mr. Goldsmith says, however, do you recall receiving that transcript prior to the time that the cable was sent out? The cable I'm referring to, the cable of October 9th of 1963. I'm sure I saw it because I read every piece of paper that came from that monitoring establishment, which was in Spanish, in other words. Coming in from the Cuban embassy, so I'm sure that I saw it, but I also have the recollection that it didn't mean anything to me. I'm sorry to say until the assassination, after the assassination when it was tied in with previous conversations. For summary purposes, then, it would appear that if standard procedure was followed, you would have received that transcript within a few days of the intercept having been made. Yes. And your recollection, I guess, based on testimony from 76 that you read this afternoon and any further thoughts you had, is that you did in fact receive this transcript prior to the time that the cable went out, October 9th, 63. I'm sure I must have. I don't recall specifically that I did. As I explained before, I was in the process in Mexico City of changing from one job to another, doing two jobs, and Mr. Robert Shaw was the man who really was sort of the detail man on these Cuban operations at that time. You also indicated this morning that your testimony, based upon the transcripts, the testimony that you gave to the committee in November 76, was based upon information that acquired after the assassination. Is that an accurate statement, or is that a statement you would now like to qualify? Well, what I said, Counselor, was that after that number of years, there are so many things that I had read in magazines and heard on television talk shows and that sort of thing that it sometimes has been very difficult for me, as it continues to be today, to remember when something comes up about Oswald's visit to Mexico, whether I read it in the National Enquirer or whether it's something from my own memory. Mr. Goldsmith says, in the specific context of your testimony before the committee in November of 76, is it accurate to say that the only time you ever indicated to Mr. Sprague, who was the lawyer that was questioning you, that you were basing statements upon after acquired information was in reference to a quotation that appeared in the Washington newspaper quoting you? And other than that, you never indicated to Mr. Sprague that your testimony before the committee that day was based upon after acquired information? Is that an accurate summary? I think that is accurate. That testimony was preceded that previous day. I think that testimony was some 3.5 hours. It was preceded by a day of questioning by a staff member, which lasted, I believe, 6 hours. And during that time, I may have made some reference. But yes, I didn't make a great point of saying that I was telling him things that I might have gotten somewhere else. I was trying to tell him things that I remembered to the best of my ability. Mr. Goldsmith then says, Mr. Phillips, are you certain that prior to 10/8, the October 8th cable being sent to CIA headquarters, that you discussed this with Redacted in Mexico City? By discuss this, I'm referring specifically to Oswald's contact with the Soviet embassy. Yes, I believe we did discuss it. Do you remember where you were when you discussed it? Either Redacted walked into my office or I walked into his office. I think it may have been the latter, and we discussed, I believe, he said, have you seen this or vice versa? Or brought it up to the subject some way, but I definitely remember reading it in its typed draft before it was a telegraphic message. Are you certain, Mr. Phillips, that at that time, which would have been on or about October 8th, you were in Mexico City? I left Mexico City at one time during that period to go to the funeral of a nephew who had been killed in an automobile accident, but I certainly don't recall that it was at that time. No, I believe I was there. I can't be absolutely positive. I may have. Often we went back and forth to headquarters for consultation, and I made that trip, but I don't remember being out of Mexico City at that time. I would like to ask you now to refer to CIA document number 11. All right, sir. This is a cable to the Mexico City station and others from the director. Is that correct? Yes. The date is September 30th, 1963. I see here something that looks like upper left-hand corner, 30th September 63. Yes, 30th September of 63. Without reading through the entire cable, would you please take a look at page 12, CIA number 12, and read what is written there? Whereupon the witness reads the document in parentheses, and it says, Michael D. Choden refers to you, does it not? Yes, that is I. And it indicated that at least at the time, September 30th, you were presently TDY headquarters. What does TDY mean? Temporary duty. So we know that September 30th, according to this cable, you were in headquarters. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. Now, before you indicated that you thought you were in Mexico City, do you have any basis for being able to explain why you thought you were in Mexico City at the time? Only that I don't recall even now why I was in headquarters on this TDY. I only have one copy of the next document I'm going to show you. May I ask, where is headquarters? Is that Washington? Or yes, sir, that would be Washington. Mr. Chairman, I only have one copy of this agency document, so I will have the witness read it. I'm referring to CIA document number 252. It is not a good quality copy, but could you try to read this committee, this section? Mr. David Phillips, newly assigned Chief PB Room in OPS, that means Cuban operations, in Mexico, will arrive 7 October, Eastern Airlines, for 2 days consultation. This is to the station in Miami. Right. Does that go ahead? Mr. Mr. Phillips says not necessarily meet or make reservations for Mexico. Mr. Phillips ETA 9 October on guest airlines. So this would be a cable sent from headquarters saying that I was stopping in Miami for 2 days. My first question is, the cable refers to you in your true name, does it not? Yes. Would that be in keeping with agency procedure, sending a cable referencing to a case officer by his true name? It would be done in a case like this where in Mexico, of course, they would know my pseudonym, and in headquarters, they would know my pseudonym, but not necessarily in a third station such as Miami. And my next question is, according to the cable, it indicates that your return in Mexico City was estimated to be October 9th. Yes, 1963. So it seems to indicate that from the very least, from September 30th, 63 until October 9th, 63, you were not in Mexico City. It certainly does. Do you recall now where you were at that time? It was during this period that I learned that I was going to be shifted from one job to another and go to Cuban operations, so I obviously went back to headquarters to discuss Cuban operations. And on the way, stopped because Miami was concerned with Cuba on the way back. Well, it would seem that the more fundamental question is not even so much do you recall where you were, but on what basis you gave testimony to the committee in 1976 and earlier today describing a conversation that you had with Redacted and the cable that was to be sent out when in fact you weren't even there. Yes, it does. Is there any way that you could explain that? No, sir, I cannot. The only explanation that I can give is that I was suddenly involved in this Cuban business at a time when a lot was happening and that I was asked to testify in 1976 so many years later. My recollection of events was that I was involved in Cuban matters, as indeed I would have been during that temporary duty in headquarters. I did not recall that I was at headquarters during that time. So at the very least, the conversation with Redacted never took place, and that redaction is Ann Goodpasture. If that cable went out on the 10th and I didn't, it went out on the 8th. On the 8th. Mexico City station to headquarters. No, before it went out, I obviously was mistaken. There were also conflicts between your description of the cables and the cables that we went over this morning. Without going over the conflict again, is there a way that you can explain the discrepancies? Mr. Phillips then says the best explanation for the discrepancy is I have what I was referring to this morning, saying that I would like to talk about the background under which I gave that testimony in 1976, what instigated it, and you said that I would have 5 minutes later to explain that. And it is, to me, the explanation of discrepancies in that testimony of 1976. I think now might be an appropriate time to give you a chance to discuss that. All right. I retired from the CIA in 1975 to form this organization. One of the things that I did frequently on a daily basis was talk to newspaper people. Our organization is sort of active as a clearinghouse for the press on intelligence matters. As a former newspaperman, I felt I knew how to talk to newspaper people, and so I talked to them. And during a period when I literally have now talked to several hundred newspaper people, only on 2 occasions did I think that I was taken, and one of them was by an article in the Washington Post by a Mr. Ron Kessler, which came out the day before my testimony and was the reason that I was called down to testify. Mr. Kessler contacted me. We had a long lunch. We had a second lunch. He talked to me on the phone a number of times. A number of weeks went by, and he was talking about Mexico City at the time of the Kennedy assassination and trying to get me to tell him everything he could. I didn't realize until after the story came out, really, or towards the very end of my conversations with him, that apparently Mr. Kessler had talked to 2 other people who were in Mexico, a translator and a secretary, and he told me that they said that Lee Harvey Oswald told the Soviets that he wanted his ticket paid for and he had a lot of fabulous information to give them in this, that, and the other. When a newspaperman talks long enough, sometimes you find yourself agreeing with him on the basis of facts that don't really exist. For instance, during those conversations, he said, well, I already know the whole story. Here I have all the documents I received under Freedom of Information Act, the cables, and that sort of thing. So I came away from conversations with Mr. Kessler having absorbed some of the things he was saying. That sounds like such bullshit, doesn't it? The second part of that thing was that I had a book that was about to be published. I was engaged in the business of trying to make a living by lecturing. I was on television shows and that sort of thing. And I don't think there is any question in my mind that at that time I tended to perhaps over-dramatize a little bit my role. After all, if you write a book and spend a year doing it, you hope it will be sold and all that sort of thing. Since that time, although I've continued this public activity, I have tried to be very, very careful. I am not especially proud of the accuracy of that testimony, and I'm certainly am really surprised to realize that I was out of town for that period, even though it was still on Cuban matters. That is the best explanation I can give you, sir. We have a vote on the floor if you're convenient breaking here. I am. And then they take a break. Mr. Phillips, we've just had a brief recess. For that purpose of summarizing, I'd like you to review your last statement. First, we have a situation here where there are conflicts between your version of the cables as described in your testimony in 1976 and the cables we showed you today. We also have conflicts between the transcripts that you talked about, or in the transcript in particular that you discussed, and those we showed you today. And we have a situation where you were absent from Mexico City, and yet you told the committee in November of 76 that you had signed off on a cable and that you had a conversation with Ann Goodpasture, and also that you had in fact seen the transcript when you couldn't have seen it until sometime after that. Your explanation, I believe, in part, is that you attribute this conversation that you had with a newspaper man, and that also you, before the committee, you over-dramatized your role. Is that an accurate statement? I hope I didn't do it before the committee. I think what you have said is accurate. I do not recall, did I say that I remember distinctly signing off on the cable, or that under the circumstances I would. In any event, I accept what you have said as valid summary of what happened. Did anyone at the agency, and by agency I'm referring to the CIA, instruct you or ask you to give that testimony in November of 76? Absolutely not. Having read that testimony during the afternoon recess, were there any other parts of it that you found to be untrue? Well, in reading it this afternoon and looking back, I felt that I certainly had exaggerated to an extent to which I was pushing redacted, and I now know why. I wasn't there to push him and so forth, but I don't recall any specific thing that was untrue, no. Mr. Chairman, any questions? Mr. Sawyer? I'll pass. Mr. Fithian? I have no questions on this part. We're going on with some others. Yes, we are. This is the questioning you're completing here regarding what we were doing on this morning, Counselor. Is that correct? Yes. Did you have any other questions, Mr. Chairman, that you're going to ask? Well, if you have further area to go on to, I will withhold my questions until such time as you are finished. I do have another area. All right, so then they withhold a bunch of questions, and then... Mr. Phillips, when you were in Mexico City in 63, were you at one time Chief of Covert Action? Yes, I was. When? From the time of my arrival, which was the fall of 61, until sometime in 1963. What does the term covert action mean? In its broadest sense, it is the propaganda, political action type thing. In this case, primarily it had to do with Cuba because the Cuban embassy in Mexico City was a focal point for their propaganda activities, and throughout Latin America they were sending couriers through and that sort of thing. So in effect, as opposed to regular intelligence operations running agents and getting information, I was more concerned with media, not only in Mexico but Latin America, providing materials for it and trying to counter Cuban influence. All right, so let me pause right here. Who else in our long cast of characters was directly involved with distributing propaganda in South and Latin America? Gaudet. Gaudet did. Gaudet was, right? William Gaudet, who ran the Latin American report and who was constantly flying down to Mexico and who got his visa on the same date, September 17th, as Oswald, allegedly, right? So he had to have been 100% directly in contact with David Atlee Phillips, because this is what they were doing. This is what David Atlee Phillips' job was, but he was based in Mexico City, whereas Gaudet was based in New Orleans. So yeah, there's no possibility they didn't know each other. And so think long and hard about what are the implications of the fact that Gaudet and David Atlee Phillips knew each other. So in effect, as opposed to regular intelligence operations, running agents and getting information, I was more concerned with the media, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America, providing materials for it and trying to counter Cuban influence. So your major target was then Cuba, is that correct? Yes. And your goal would be to counter Cuban influence? Yes. And part of my job was Soviet influence as well, but it was largely Cuban, some Soviet. Understood. Would you define for the committee what the term asset means in agency jargon? Well, generally speaking, a lot of people use different definitions, but to me, an asset is someone who isn't necessarily an agent, isn't necessarily on your payroll, someone who is cooperative with you, someone who is on a witting basis knows they're helping you get a job done. Sometimes that can sort of spill over and say our assets include this agent who we pay and so forth. So often it is used in the sense of someone who simply is either manipulatable or someone who's helping you because they believe in the same thing that you believe in or that sort of thing. It can, on some occasions, refer to an agent. For purposes of consistency now, if you were working with a journalist, this is by way of an example, on a propaganda operation, assuming all this is on a witting level, would you characterize him as an agent or an asset? Generally, as an agent, I think it would depend on the audience you were talking to. If you were in a group here in Washington with people from different agencies, you might say we have an asset who can arrange this, but certainly in-house, you would be more inclined to say agent than asset, but it could be used both ways. How specifically would you carry out a particular propaganda operation? For example, if you wanted to generate a particular story, what ways would you go about doing that? Well, often the stories you wanted to generate were a result of some sort of instructions from headquarters, perhaps just from Mexico, perhaps worldwide, perhaps for Latin America, in which we have the following points that we want to make, and specifically, you would go out and you would meet your agent or your asset, but generally your agent, and say, look, what do you think about this? And he would usually agree with you and write and say an editorial or a news story, which made that point. Did you work with your agents personally, or did you direct their work through one of your CIA subordinates? In a few cases, I worked with them personally. However, there were other people who were subordinate who handled more people than I did. Or when you say in a few cases, how many? On a regular basis, I think I really probably met with about 2 at a time, perhaps something like that, of foreigners, Mexicans, of foreigners. Then I might go out and see an American who in turn was working with them, but usually 2 or 3, something like that, not much more. I'm not sure that I understand the answer. 2 or 3 meaning what? During a particular time period, a month, a week, you might see 2 or 3 agents directly. I might see them once or twice a week. What I'm referring to is that I felt that I was the case officer for. I was the guy who went out and talked with, say, 2 or 3 of these agents at a time. So as a matter of routine, you would work directly with your agents on some occasions, and on other occasions you would work through subordinates. Yeah. To what extent did you use one technique more than another? I did more sort of management than I did case officer work. That is, Mr. Shaw and someone working with Mr. Shaw would go out to meet people more frequently than I would. Then I would go out and I would meet with the outside American who was not attached to the embassy, who had agents working for him, and I would meet with him and plan what those agents would do at his direction. But I would never meet those agents, and very seldom did any of these Cuban exile organizations that were in existence during the time you were in Mexico City have representatives in Mexico City. Yes, I believe that all representatives in Mexico City, all of them had representatives in Mexico City. And did you use any of them in your covert action operations? We had contact with them, and this was that and the other. We used one group of Cubans, which was not really so much an exile organization, but a group of Cubans who worked together at our direction. But in speaking of the different political groups at different times for Mexico, a lot of them were met by people there, but I don't recall any of the particular groups that we worked with on a consistent basis. I just noticed one of these cables that I read that had to do with a group called Juror and so forth. Obviously, they had made contact with us, but I do not recall specific groups that we worked with from Mexico City. And you mentioned before that you did work with a specific group of Cubans. What was your own developed group? Was that your own developed group? Yes, because one of the things they did, for instance, was they had a reception center where people coming out of Cuba would be debriefed, and they would meet them just after they had come out, and they would ask them questions, and that we prepared to gather information. That sort of cover for the operation was the humanitarian, one of them telling these people where to go find places to stay and this and that and the other. Our primary interest, however, was to gather intelligence from them by debriefing them. While you were in Mexico City and after the assassination of the president, did you ever undertake any propaganda operation that pertained to the assassination of Mr. Kennedy? Oh, here we go. Mr. Phillips says, I don't recall that I did. I think you would know that, wouldn't you? I recall at a later date a message coming out from headquarters which went to a number of stations which talked about steps which could be taken to counter the stories going around saying the CIA was involved. But I recall that as being after I left Mexico. I don't recall any such undertaking in Mexico. It could have been, but I don't think so. Okay. After you left Mexico, what specific propaganda operation were you involved in with regard to the assassination? I don't recall that I was. I do recall that there was what is known as a book message that went to a number of stations, which said, look, here's another viewpoint about the stories that are going around. It specifically referred to Mr. Mark Lane and said, try to do this. Now, I was asked this once in a public debate, and I believe I thought at the time it was redacted. It was more likely now, I think, when I was in the redacted and when we were so busy in the redacted that we noted the message, but I'm not sure if we did anything about it. Mr. Goldsmith says, okay, while you were in Cuba, you also were involved in covert action, as you just described that term. Yes, I was. And was your job description there similar to the one you just gave us in Mexico City? No, it was not. The reason is that when I was in Cuba on 2 occasions, first occasion I was there as a staff officer of the CIA, undercover, using the cover of my lectures. I had been lecturing on Latin America previously, so I was a covert action officer then. I returned to Cuba in 1958 after having resigned from the agency to establish a public relations firm. I was going to make $1 million type thing. I did retain, however, an association with the agency because they asked me if I would work on a contract basis, and he was sheep-dipped. Sheep-dipped. Funny how they sheep-dip people just to go work and do private stuff. Like Castro wouldn't know the difference. Holy shit, it's hilarious. However, I concentrated. I didn't do the covert action. Was almost purely propaganda type work and working with groups that weren't revolutionary groups, such as students and labor and that sort of thing, but not political groups. During the time that you were in Cuba, did you ever use the operational alias Mr. Abbott? I think that sounds familiar. I might very well have used that. And while you were in Cuba, did you tend to have a more direct personal contact with your agents than you did in Mexico City? I would say less, because it seems to me there were a lot less agents. But on a relative basis, did you tend to have more? I think the first time when I was in Chile in 55 or 56, more or less the same. The second time greatly reduced. You just said Chile. Did you mean Cuba? I meant Cuba, of course. oh, I'm sure he did. But no, he was in Chile at some point, wasn't he? The second time greatly reduced because that was when I was starting a public relations firm and was only spending literally part-time on that. While you're in Cuba, I believe in 58 through 60, was it? Did you ever start spending full-time activity on covert action operations? In the sense that I was working, yes, because the public relations business went out of, there was no public relations business. So before I left Cuba, it was none of that. So any work I did was for the CIA, but it wasn't full-time. What happened to your agents in Cuba after you left, do you know? I think generally the answer to that is that they went into exile. So most of them went to the States. Yes, I would guess so. And did you ever use any of them again? Yes. Now, wait a minute. I certainly used some of my assets, people I had known there, especially people who were in the newspaper business and who then I would approach. I approached in Miami at the time of the preparations for Bay of Pigs and saw to it that they got out exile editions of their newspapers. All right, guys, we're going to call it here for today. We're on page 71 of 108. We might be able to wrap this up tomorrow. Let me see if I can't knock this out by then. And then I did find another interview of David Atlee Phillips before I started the show today, dated 11/27/76. So I found the initial November 76 transcript. So when we get through with this one, we'll spend, looks like we're going to spend about 4 days on his executive session testimony from 76. Whereas this one here is from 1978. But, all right. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see you guys tomorrow.